The 13-member Polkadot Council has been an important part of ensuring the network operated smoothly and continued to evolve in line with the community's desires. And until now, this group has served its purpose, but there are big changes coming. Welcome to the Parachain Auctions podcast. I'm Brian Hoffman, crypto platform product lead. And on this show, you'll hear from leaders and innovators from around the world building parachains on Polkadot and Kusama. Tune in for insights from the best and brightest about their new projects. Whether this is the first you've heard of parachains or you're a DeFi aficionado, come with us behind the scenes as we explore the technology of the future today. Okay, today we have quite a heavyweight on the show. We welcome Joe Petrowski, technical integrations lead at Web3 Foundation, to the podcast. Joe, thanks so much for joining us. It's really great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
We're lucky to have yet another member of Web3 to join us. I'd love to get to know a little bit more about you, your background, and how you kind of came to this role. Just to kick it off, I read on a description of you online. You actually worked on some space stuff or something, I think, prior to blockchain. How did you get into that? And then how did you end up in blockchain?
Yeah, working on satellite launch was my first job out of university. And partly just I was really into skiing, wanted a job in Colorado. And I found one that was pretty interesting. And so I worked there for 6 years doing shock and vibration simulation. And that's actually I got into blockchain, I guess, on a practical level on kind of something quite similar to that. But I started out just kind of generally interested in blockchain on more of the philosophical level. I was living in Denver at the time. I think 2011 or 12, just heard about Bitcoin and stuff at some meetups and thought that it was interesting. Didn't really get too into it. I think after the Edward Snowden stuff came out, I got a little bit more interested in Web3 and blockchain stuff in general, but it was still a very kind of esoteric interest. I didn't really see how it applied much to my life. And then I think I went really into it in 2015, like late 2014 or early 2015. I moved to England. So I quit my job as an engineer, decided to try to be a professional cyclist, which I kind of failed at, but I ended up moving to Europe and staying here long term because of it. And just the process of trying to set up a bank account and stuff and transfer money from England to the UK, it was a huge nightmare that took months, and nothing really went smoothly. It was really expensive, and I kind of thought, up to that point, I had taken pretty much the standard, the American path of go to high school, go to university, get a corporate job, buy a house, all this stuff, and I had pretty much followed the track that's quite typical. And everything kind of worked, but I didn't do anything completely absurd by moving to England. It was just by going just a tiny bit outside of that track, everything became really difficult. And I just kind of had this kind of light bulb moment of, if such a small perturbation of leaving what's typical kind of shatters how the system works, then it probably actually doesn't work for the vast majority of people. It has a very shiny surface, and it looks like it works. And a bunch of people who wear suits and fly private jets and stuff, it makes it look good, but it probably actually is not that what's the word I'm looking for, the opposite of fragile, robust. It's probably not very robust, or it doesn't have a lot of fundamentals in it. And that's when I got a lot more into blockchain and Web3 stuff, was just kind of that realization. In my last year or two of cycling, I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to do next. I didn't really want to move back to America, and tried to start a couple of my own businesses. And I'd always been into investing in the stock market and stuff since I was a little kid. Just thought it was interesting. And I thought, okay, well, I modeled shock and vibration stuff, and this is just random time series, and a stock price is kind of like that. So I could probably write some kind of algorithm to model and predict this. And I actually kind of thought that I had invented algorithmic trading myself. And of course, when I went and Googled and searched for this, there's tons of research, and that's actually what most of the trading is. So there's a lot there. Anyway, I tried that for a while, and it turns out the New York Stock Exchange just doesn't like open up its API to you. And even just
Yeah.
like getting good data sets that don't have a lot of noise or like outliers in them can be really tough. And I just kind of thought like, oh, this, I've been into this blockchain and Web3 stuff for a while, just been interested in it. And there's all these like free data sets and open APIs and like all these different wrappers and different languages that you can use. And it was just really, I find it kind of ironic that crypto is really hard to use narrative, because at least for what I was trying to do, I thought actually this is really easy to use. Like this is much easier
Mhm.
than other systems to use. It's very like open and the community is very welcoming. And that's when I first got into it. And then I eventually decided to work on a protocol, and I stopped doing like my kind of entrepreneur stuff and put that behind me. And in 2018, started working on Polkadot.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, it's quite a journey you've had. I always think about blockchain sort of like, you find people around the world that say are like fans of Superman, but it's like they have all come into like the Superman timeline at different points, right? So like people early in crypto have like a different kind of perspective and like what they value most out of Bitcoin and blockchain. And then there's like folks that are joining this last year, and it's like their whole world is like centered around NFTs, for instance. It's like, but it's completely different type of people. And one of the interesting things that you kind of talked about there, describing your past, is like you said you find it surprising that people complain that it's hard to use blockchain. You're coming from an engineering perspective, right? Like, and you're completely right. Like, I mean, I have a programming background, and just the fact that you have so much access to open data, and the spirit of the communities around APIs and building more access, it's a dream come true for our type of personalities. But for a lot of people, it's still very confusing. But maybe you can explain a little bit about like, having understood early blockchain and what the challenges were and like how it was valuable. You were talking about like sending transfers of value over borders and things onto Web3, which, yeah, I mean, I guess it's still somewhat about that, but there's more of this like computing, like global computing system and smart contracts. It's kind of moved into DeFi. Like, what made you kind of gravitate more towards what Parity and Web3 are working on with Polkadot? Was it the scaling? Was it, you know, I don't know. Just maybe you could help me understand a little bit more about like what's so fascinating about that area, or did you just fall into it?
Yeah, I partly fell into it, and it was a lot of discovery. And when I decided in 2018 that I didn't really want to like be a entrepreneur anymore and wanted to work in a larger team, I was applying to quite a few jobs, and a lot of them were kind of like research analyst positions in like an investment research type of company. And I knew I kind of had the background and skills to do that. And it was actually just a conversation with a friend of mine who had worked who had worked on Wall Street for a long time, and he said, a lot of times like you're not really impacting people's decisions with that research. Like they need to kind of justify what they're doing, so they kind of ask a research analyst to put together some justification for what they want to do. And the idea of like working on a protocol directly, it was completely new to me. Like I didn't come from a software background. Um, I came from like a mechanical and aerospace engineering background, and I had never used GitHub before. Like I got a kind of walkthrough on how to use GitHub when I started working on Polkadot, and yeah, I just decided to kind of roll the dice and try something completely new where I thought I would have a bigger impact, and yeah, maybe be able to like drive the actual direction of a protocol development and see what I could contribute. And really, in my time working on Polkadot, like my kind of mental model of a blockchain has really changed, and it's probably become like more computer sciencey. More towards the direction of thinking of blockchain as like a finite state machine, which might not mean a ton of stuff to people, but if you think about like a blockchain as a generalized computer, then it starts you start to realize like, okay, well, if we have a computer that we're using, it would be a real shame if like the only thing that we could come up with to use this computer for is like an Excel spreadsheet to keep track of like how much tokens a bunch of people have. Like there's obviously so much more that you can do with a computer, like a video chat, like we're doing right now.
Hmm.
There's tons of applications that you can build, and I just started to realize that like the idea of thinking about like only the tokens and like the Bitcoin model. And I'm not saying like Bitcoin, that function doesn't have value or a role as part of the ecosystem, but like thinking about that as the only application of this technology is just extremely limited and short-sighted. It's just like if you had a computer and you thought the only thing that this is good for is Microsoft Excel, it's completely absurd. So then I started to get into just more, okay, like this is a very generalized system, and what can it be applied to?
Yeah, I think it's always fascinating. I mean, everybody has their own opinions about Bitcoin versus any other, system that's out or that's being worked on. But I really like the idea that there's so much more in this universe for us to do. Building protocols from scratch too, by the way, is like so challenging. I think people very much underestimate the difficulty in actually accomplishing that successfully. I mean, most programmers are using tools, and you're like poking holes in like what protocol developers have built. Protocol developers have to think about every possible scenario that programmers, good and bad, are going to like break or exploit or accidentally or intentionally. So it's pretty incredible the work that's going on. But I'm sure that like your kind of scientific and engineering mind is probably really helpful in doing that, because most people just they focus on the use case and they can't think about like the broader implications of what they're building. So specifically at Parity and Web3, maybe you could talk a little bit about your direct role there and like what you're working on right now.
Yeah. So over the last 2 years, I've been mostly focused on like integration tooling and development. So kind of as you introduced me, technical integrations lead. So I worked on stuff like RPC libraries and transaction construction libraries as kind of like product managers in like a product management type of role for those, and worked with a lot of the users who would consume those. But over the last like year, I've been slowly transitioning to work on the Common Good Parachains program. So uh, we have this kind of vision of like, first of all, moving everything off of the relay chain into parachains. So it's kind of wasteful to have functionality in the relay chain because every validator in the network needs to execute it. And
Mhm.
of course, the idea of parachains is that we can parallelize that, and only some validators need to execute each state transition. And so all this stuff like governance, staking, even balances, identity, like you name it, if it's in the relay chain, we want to move it into parachains because it just makes sense from an optimization standpoint. And it actually, the cool thing is it actually makes room for more parachains. So if you kind of think
Mhm.
about, well, when we process like all these staking transactions in a block, that's taking up validator CPU time and bandwidth that could actually be processing a parachain. So if we move that into a parachain, that actually makes room for more parachains. So it kind of like, it's not like there's some limited number of parachains, and by making a staking parachain, we're just taking a slice of that pie. We're actually saying, okay, now we can just have a bigger pie. Like there's more parachain slots available in this network, and then there's also some additional functionality. Like for the last year, like since we launched the Polkadot network, the core like token utility of Dot has been like staking and governance, and now Parachain crowd loans. And there's just other things that you could use a Dot token for. So like then the first Parachain that we launched is called Statement. It's specifically for making fungible and non-fungible assets. And so it says, okay, you can put down a deposit in Dot or on Kusama and KSM and register this asset and be able to like transfer it to another person or something like that. So there's a few other like additional little bells and whistles to add to the network. Although still like the core functionality of Polkadot is as a security and messaging network.
That's really interesting. I mean, I know that the intention around the relay chain is to be pretty thin and just kind of focus on a few core responsibilities. But I didn't realize that you guys were actually actively working to kind of consolidate that and maybe make it more optimized, efficient, and abstracting stuff out of that relay chain. I would think the temptation would be to add more there as people have needs. But do you find that it's challenging for parachain developers to like take advantage of it being it as a separate parachain, or rather than in the core? or is it pretty seamless for them to take advantage of things that you move out of like the relay chain into its own parachain? Like how do the
Uh,
parachains really like efficiently work together?
It's definitely not seamless yet, but we're getting there. So right now, Kusama is running with cross consensus messaging version 2. And I know we're working on a version 3 that will come out. But from version 0 to 1 to 2, we've added a lot of new features and capabilities to make this quite a bit smoother. But this is still a very nascent technology. So yeah, I think definitely with like the more important stuff like staking and governance, as that moves out, like it's not going to move out until the cross chain messaging is more mature and reliable. And one of the cool things though is that we can actually put backups into the relay chain. So it's not like we're just doing this you know, complete move into a parachain. What we can do is kind of say, well, this logic lives in a parachain, and we're going to basically copy it in the relay chain, but make it kind of really expensive to use, right? You could say, if you want to do like a staking transaction on the relay chain, it's going to have a really high transaction fee or something. So it kind of nudges people to use the parachain. But if there is something wrong with the parachain and like somebody has an urgent transaction that they need to make, it would still be possible on the relay chain. So the idea is really to move as much out of the relay chain as possible, but still like always have the fallback of the very core critical features like staking and governance. People should be able to access that on the relay chain in case something does go wrong on the parachain.
So this has been a vision for quite a while. This like concept around a layer zero blockchain. It's pretty unique to Polkadot and Kusama. I mean, how like personally, I'm just wondering your opinion. Like how well has this experiment fared so far? I mean, like, do you feel like it's accomplishing what you guys are seeking out to do, or is it still like very much an early work in progress?
I think both. So it's like when I see the parachains actually working on Polkadot and Kusama, it's amazing. Like there's so much progress, and like I've been working on the project for a little bit over 3 years, and there was some chart that I think Gav put out in his like year in review recap that had like the lines of code in Substrate and Polkadot for the last couple of years, and it's like it's just growing and growing. And you look at like how much has been added in the last year alone to make parachains functional, and all the cross consensus messaging stuff functional. It's really incredible. And at the same time, I see a lot of stuff that's needed to actually make it more usable, and especially more usable for parachain developers. Like you mentioned, how parachains can interact with other parachains. And so um, it's a lot of stuff that we're working on, and it's work that's both in the protocol layer, like how do you make the cross chain messaging more expressive, and on the tooling layer, how do you actually like reason about these messages between chains and index all the data between them. So if you look at like if you're looking at a single blockchain, you have a tool like Etherscan that can show you, okay, you interacted with this contract, and then here's all the stuff that happened because of it, right? But when you introduce asynchronicity into it with the cross-chain messaging, then you could just kind of look at a block and say, okay, the balance of my account changed on this block, and why, right? And then you have to kind of trace back, well, there's this other chain that sent a message, some instructions to do something. Um, and so when it comes to these very basic questions like, oh, I made a transaction, what are all the state changes? Or I found the state change, what's the root transaction that caused it? These questions become harder to answer. And
Mhm.
so we're working on a lot of the tooling to make them easier to answer, but it's definitely an iterative process. We come up with like the cross-chain messaging primitives and technology, like in response to a lot of the needs of parachain developers. But then we need to come up with the tooling and APIs and everything to actually make it easier to use once that technology gets developed. So it's still in quite a fast pace of development. And uh, to kind of go back to your original question, like, yeah, I think it's been a huge success as to see like how far we've come and how many parachains are actually interested in connecting to the network and building on Polkadot. So I'm really optimistic about the future. And at the same time, I see all this work that like as more parachains connect and want to interact, is that, oh, well, I want to interact with this other parachain in this way. So, okay, well, we need to add this feature to the cross-chain messaging. And as I see more and more in this, there is still like tons and tons of work to do. So yeah, both. I think it's I think it's been really successful so far, and there's a lot of people building in the ecosystem. And at the same time, there's still a ton of work left to do.
Yeah, I think it's probably underappreciated the fact that it's been going pretty smoothly. I would expect something so unique to have issues. I mean, I could probably rattle off half a dozen other big projects that were highly anticipated. It had so many critical issues, fundamental issues when they rolled out that they had to deal with, and I just haven't seen much of that. I mean, perhaps some of it is behind the scenes and dealt with on the engineering side, but just from an external view, it doesn't seem that that's the case. But you know, uh, so getting to the kind of the heart of the discussion I was hoping to have, these changes and these kind of upgrades to the network, they don't just happen in a vacuum. You touched on governance. Governance, I think, has had a real, I wouldn't say resurgence. It's probably a surgence. It's become increasingly important very quickly across a bunch of different blockchains. Something that a couple of years ago probably just seemed like an over engineering or over architecture of the systems, but it's really playing a valuable part for Polkadot and Kusama. I mean, where do you think governance is on the timeline here in terms of maturity, and like where do you see it going next? Like what are the hot areas that you think are exciting to you of where governance could go?
So I already think that the governance that Polkadot launched with was a huge innovation on anything that any other blockchain had done. Not just the fact that it was on chain, but the fact that it had autonomous enactments. That's really big. So when you have a proposal in Polkadot, it can't just be something that's like, we should upgrade to this version or something like that. Or like, it has to actually be like machine readable instructions. So it has to say, we want to set the code to like, we want this to be the new version of Polkadot, or we want this to be the new number of validators. So it has to be machine readable, and then that means you can kind of say yes or no. We're going to execute this machine readable code or not. And uh, of course, just given that primitive, it'd be very easy to come to a decision on chain with people voting using kind of whatever voting means a blockchain wanted. But the really cool thing in Polkadot is that this will actually execute that machine readable code if it passes. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really important because in all these, like in a lot of blockchains, we've seen this fundamental question come down to like, well, who actually decides which blockchain is which if there's a fork? And so you could have put this on chain and say we're going to vote to do this upgrade or not, and the vote on chain could overwhelmingly be to do the upgrade. But then you could have all the miners or validators decide not to upgrade the software and do that. Or you could have half of the miners upgrade their software and half of them not, and then you get like a real fork. And then how do you decide, well, which one's the chain and which one's the fork of the chain? Well, that can come down a lot to like, well, is there like a foundation behind it? Or what do data aggregators or exchanges like Kraken recognize as the chain and the fork, right? And those aren't necessarily stakeholders in the chain, right? They didn't necessarily participate in that governance decision. So you're kind of like you have this decision making mechanism, but you've offloaded the actual enactment of the decision to somebody else. And the decision doesn't have a lot of, or like the democratic process doesn't have a lot of merit, or it's not very strong if people don't actually believe that the outcome of the democratic process is going to be followed. And uh, on Polkadot, it actually enacts that. It actually enacts the decision itself. And so even for an upgrade of its own logic, stuff that would require for like a hard fork on other chains, if you wanted to change, like add new functions to the blockchain, you can just do that via a proposal because Polkadot actually stores the logic for itself in its own chain. And that's another like rabbit hole that we could go down. But it's kind of like we call it a meta protocol because it has like, it's a protocol that describes a blockchain protocol. And it's actually just saying like, my protocol is part of my own state. It's like, it has like an identity almost.
Mm-hmm.
And it can change that. And so it has the rules for how do you change what the blockchain is. And so I think that's really interesting and has been like a big innovation from Polkadot. And where we're going is also quite interesting. So kind of like a few months ago, we started to have some discussions about like how governance should change. Of course, like a lot of things, we launched governance with like a Genesis configuration and setup and modules and everything. And of course, you see it in action and decide that there's better ways to go. And so there's a bunch of PRs out there in the Substrate and Polkadot repos that people can check out. But we're kind of in the process of proposing a new form of governance that would actually, so we have like right now in Polkadot, this council and a technical committee, and then of course like the general stakeholder body that like would be all the token holders. And we're actually moving away from that model of a council and just making it like wide open. Like everything would go through some kind of public referendum. So you can kind of think of the council as like a concentrated form of vote delegation. Like people have voted for the council. And of course, like the council is chosen by like all the stakeholders at large. People can choose like which councilors they want to represent them. But then like the council is limited to 13 seats. So you've kind of like taken this whole network and kind of pointed it at 13 seats and said like, we're kind of like, trust is the wrong word because things still go to like a majority rules referendum. But kind of like, we want these people to kind of curate some of the proposals that come in and kind of say like, yes, this is reasonable, this is not reasonable. And of course, that's quite limiting because it's limited to 13. Only 13 members can be on that. And so we'd like to do away with that and just make it completely open, but have a much stronger system of vote delegation. So, of course, there are a lot of people who don't want to participate in every single proposal. Maybe they don't want to. So I'm on the council and it ends up being a lot of work because people have like proposals from the public treasury and stuff, and you have to review every single one. There are runtime upgrades. I like to review the code. What changes have been made? Like, is this a reasonable upgrade to make? It's a lot of work, and most people don't want to do all that stuff. But they might have somebody that they kind of like trust to generally act on their behalf, and so they could delegate to them. And when that person votes, the delegated votes also get applied. And so the new version of governance would be more heavily reliant on delegation and making that much easier for users to do. And I think there's even stuff about like the first time when you make a delegation, there's no transaction fee. So it's kind of like free to delegate your votes to somebody else. And you can maybe change your delegation like every, X blocks or something. So like every month or something, if you wanted to update your delegations. And we even want to make it like more fluid. So you could say like, I want to delegate to this person when it comes to treasury spending proposals, but I want to delegate to this person when it comes to like technical things like runtime upgrades. And that way you still have like a body of people who's been delegated to and may have like some more voice or responsibility in the network, but it's not limited to these 13 seats. It's just whatever distribution organically forms. So that's the direction that things are going, doing away with this like council and technical committee model and trying to make it so that everything goes through a referendum, but that it's much easier to express like delegation and having other like expressing that you agree with somebody else's opinion on a matter and will kind of vote along with their direction.
This whole transformation is fascinating because growing a community and having like, some kind of appropriate governance when it's small is completely different than when you're trying to get to scale. And I think, a lot of what you described earlier with the council and stuff is kind of a means to like bootstrap the success of the system, right? Like it's hard to just let everybody go wild initially, but you can see where like different types of governance in other parts of life break down and some of these processes and like what you guys are trying to like get around. Like, you see a network like Facebook, it starts out with just, some school kids or whatever. And yet now we have 1 billion users on that platform. And we're still seeing it's kind of managed by this like council of Zuck and like his executives or whatever. And you see like all the pitfalls of like what that's led to. And then you even project further and you look at like the U.S. government or like other state governments around the world. And all the issues they're having. It's almost amazing to think that these nations still exist. Considering that it was these founding fathers sitting around trying to guess how a country someday, it was 300 million people, was going to operate under these governance rules. And
Right.
yeah, so it's just amazing to see like how far that's evolved, and like now we get to let like these engineers and technologists try and like figure these problems out.
I think it's quite similar to Vitalik had a post a month or two ago about bridges that said basically like, well, when they're small, they're totally secure because nobody's going to bother attacking them. But actually, as they get more utilized and more valuable, they become a honeypot, and
Mm-hmm.
that has like an inverse security effect. Like the more they get used, the less secure they become because the incentive to attack them becomes much higher. And I think governance is actually quite similar when something is very small. The informal governance, like the core devs call and stuff, that kind of works because it's small enough that you can probably say like quite confidently that like the majority of people who are affected or have a strong interest in the system's direction would be like kind of be able to express their voice in that forum. But when something becomes bigger, and I think like the 2017 like Bitcoin SegWit stuff was an example. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes much harder to define like, well, who's a stakeholder, who's affected by this,
Yeah.
and like as the community grows, it's important to have these formal definitions and to extend it to your nation state example. Like there are certainly people around the world who feel affected by America's economic or foreign policies, but they have no means to actually express
Exactly.
their voice in like how that in like the direction or like the leadership of the country. And the cool thing with blockchains, especially if you have on-chain governance like Polkadot, is yes, you need to be a stakeholder. Like there is a formal mechanism to actually express voice in the system, and it's holding tokens and voting with them. But there is a permissionless way for anybody to become a stakeholder. So if you feel that Polkadot affects you, just like if you feel like I don't have a Facebook account personally, but I know that Facebook affects me, um, because they keep profiles on everybody and their web activity, even if they don't have a Facebook profile themselves. Um, like there isn't really like a formal means for me to become a member of that Facebook board that's like Zuck and the people you mentioned. So the cool thing with blockchains is like there is actually a formal way to say like, hey, I feel affected by this system, but I actually have a means to become a member of it and voice my opinion within it.
Now, one thing that I think about while I work at Kraken, and prior to Kraken, I worked for 6 years on a decentralized protocol. So, uh, kind of two different perspectives here. Is like this, like decentralized versus centralized. We have a ton of Polkadot on our centralized platform, and part of what you said only works. Like the governance only works if like the end users can actually participate. So if they're kind of participating through a centralized exchange such as Kraken or Binance or Coinbase, um, it could potentially break that model, right? Like because most exchanges either abstain from voting on proposals, or they don't have the means to do so, or they just blindly follow the foundation or whatever. Um, like, do you see this as being a mid to long term issue? And I mean, maybe you don't, but how do you think that situation could improve? I mean, for us, we're always thinking about ways we can fix that or make it better. But
Yeah,
yeah,
so we definitely like getting more involvement from various entities is something that we're interested in, and you obviously already have some kind of like trust relationship with your users, but one of the things like that I know it's like kind of in the plans to implement is being able to like split the votes on an account. So you could say like, okay, I have this account with 100 dot on it. And for whatever reason, I want to use 70 dot to vote aye and 30 dot to vote nay.
mm,
And that could be many reasons. Like it's like an omnibus type of wallet, or it could be that account actually belongs to a parachain, and the users on that parachain have a plurality of views, and the parachain wants to express that plurality via its account and by splitting its vote. And actually, actually expressing that split becomes important, because in one of the changes that we're proposing in the next version of governance is to have this kind of like decreasing turnout requirement. So right now you kind of see like referenda have like a start date and an end date, and it just kind of says like whatever the, if the passing threshold, if a referendum is passing at the end, then it passes, right?
Mhm.
But we're kind of introducing these new curves where you would have like a turnout and approval rating, and at the end of the referendum, they would converge to 0 and 50% respectively. But at the beginning, they would be very high. So you could kind of start at like day zero of a referendum and say like, in order to pass this now, like if we want to pass this on the first day of the referendum, we would need 90% of the network to turn out with like 99% in favor. Like it'd have to be just completely overwhelming to pass this now. And those will steadily drop. So maybe by like day 7, you could say, okay, we need 60% of the network to turn out with, 80% in favor. And these kind of just continually decrease towards 0 and 50 at the very end of it. And so definitely getting more users to participate in governance is a big priority, because we want to have these turnouts that are like 50-60% of the network, so that can be completely represented in all of these votes. And right now the turnout can be really low, and I think part of that is just like accessibility. People don't know where to find information on the votes. They don't know how to assess the votes necessarily, and also the difficulty of delegation. So you might say, "Oh, I wish my voice were heard in this," but like my opinion is that like I'm not really an engineer, and I trust
Yeah.
Brian to kind of like, he seems pretty sensible, so I'm going to like delegate to him and make sure that like my voice is still expressed in these referenda.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And you spoke to like, people kind of deferring and saying, "Oh, this is difficult," or whatever. I know a lot of the people that I speak to that are pretty active in Polkadot, they use Polkadot JS as like kind of the front end to participate in governance activities and other things. And to my knowledge, I'm not super aware of any other, like many other tools that make it easier to do this. It kind of seems to be like the de facto place to do all this. How do you guys look at the evolution of that product, and like, are you trying to figure out ways to encourage other platforms and apps and stuff to like incorporate some of these more complex features and build a better user experience so that more people participate?
Yeah, I'm not the best person to talk about this, because I've been kind of using the Polkadot JS UI since
You're one of the people
the
I'm talking
very
about, huh? Okay.
the very beginning, and I'm like, this all just makes sense to me. But no, in all seriousness, I like there are quite a few proposals that go through like the public treasury to build better wallets and user interfaces and portals to the stuff. Um, and also, I do believe there is a team at Parity that's like working on a new like libraries and user experience, and some stuff that's like more focused on doing this. So it's definitely a priority. It's obviously like feedback that we get all the time, that a lot of like the Polkadot JS UI stuff is quite difficult for like new users to
Mhm.
understand. So yeah, we're doing a lot of parallel efforts, like funding external teams and working internally on new stuff to help improve that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look back to when we first at Kraken were starting to build out Parachain auction support, there weren't a lot of examples to look at and say, "Oh, this is like kind of best of breed user experience. Like this is what people expect. This is like what people understand." Is all new, like foreign concepts. Um, I think the only way for places like Kraken to do this effectively is to be close to the engineers and kind of understand what the intent and like why does Polkadot.js make so much sense to you? Like, what are you guys trying to accomplish there? Like, what are the goals of those features? And then we can turn those things into something that will get the next 5 billion people, using Polkadot rather than, the millions or whatever that are already using it. That's really important to us. And I really appreciate, the openness of the Polkadot community. You guys, everybody's been really, really good about working with us to try and help us build better experiences for our customers. You talked a little bit about the council going away. What does that look like timeline wise? I mean, is that something that we're looking at, happening soon, or is that just kind of long-term aspiration at this point?
Yeah, I would say probably this year, actually. I think it's like I'm always afraid to put timelines on stuff, but I
Yes.
know a lot of the actual implementation work is done, and that some of the auditors are taking a look at it. The next plan would be to roll it out to Kusama, of course, first. So it would kind of depend on how long it takes to get to Kusama. Um, I would kind of, I would guess somewhere around like 3 months. So, by like June this year. But that is really a complete guess. I don't know. Don't hold me to that. And then after kind of some time of seeing that happen, on seeing it used on Kusama, maybe, hopefully making some tweaks based on what we learned there, eventually moving it to Polkadot. So for something, for like small kind of like new features in palettes and like new versions of stuff, like, you kind of see usually a couple of weeks difference between Kusama and Polkadot. For something as critical as governance, I would expect it to be more of like a 6 month difference before like rolling it out to Polkadot. But yeah, I would kind of I would roll the dice on it happening this year.
Great. So we talked a lot about governance. Just outside of governance and Polkadot, Kusama in general, I talked to a lot of people. They're mostly kind of talking about the individual parachains and what they're working on. A lot of things like Remark are getting a lot of traction. What's like your top thing that you find most fascinating right now about the space? Like what's the thing that you got your eye on and you find really interesting?
Yeah, I'm really excited to see the first multi-chain like applications, or chains that kind of like use other chains as components in their own. I still see a lot of questions. People kind of come and say like, well, I want to build this application, but like, which parachain should I build it on, right? And
All of them.
I think of yeah, and I think of these parachains as like very specialized units, and to me, it almost sounds like, I'm building this Web 2 app. Should I build it on PayPal or Uber? Right?
Yeah.
It's like that doesn't really make sense. Like you should do like your login with Facebook and your pay with PayPal, and hail a ride with Uber, and it's all like kind of isolated and compartmentalized, right? Like these are just like little like tools that you can compose into a larger application. And I'm quite excited to see the first applications kind of roll out on Polkadot that would be built that way, where some logic is isolated in separate places. So it might be a smart contract on one chain that talks to some other chains, right? So you could say like, um, you know, maybe you have an NFT sale, but you only want to transfer it to somebody who has an identity, and you could put the marketplace in a smart contract, and that smart contract is going to like send a message to the identity chain and say, hey, this guy wants to buy an NFT, but you know, are they legit? Do they have an
Mm-hmm.
identity registered? And the identity chain can send a message back and say like, yes, they are. Like, here's all their info. And then the contract can say, okay, like we'll make this transaction. So then it'll send a message to like the assets chain and say, hey, can you swap this fungible asset for this non-fungible asset between these two accounts,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that would be like an atomic operation that either both would happen or neither. And in that way, you kind of have like this application that's like a marketplace, but it would actually be built across multiple different chains, and it wouldn't just be built on a single chain. So um, yeah, I think I've seen a lot of teams like talking about different ideas about how to do that. It is practically like it's quite difficult right now. Like the cross chain messaging isn't quite there to be able
Mm-hmm.
to do that seamlessly. But it's something we're working on and talking about a bunch of different ideas that we can implement to kind of show off like how to use this multi chain system. But I'm really looking forward to seeing the first application that kind of uses Polkadot in this way as like a single network of chains, rather than thinking about it as like a network with a bunch of options of chains.
Yeah, since you mentioned it, it's like Web 2, maybe there's a parallel between, Web 3 is the Web 1, and maybe you're foreshadowing Web 4, which would be Web 2. Maybe there'll be a Web 4 foundation in our future. But well, this is an amazing conversation. I didn't think that we'd be able to make a long conversation about governance super exciting, but I certainly enjoyed it, and hopefully our listeners found it riveting as well. And I'd love to be able to go deeper with you in the future. So we'd love to have you back. Is there anything you'd like to maybe let our audience know about that's coming up, or a place to go and find out more information about what you're working on? We'd love to hear what that would be.
Yeah, the continued rollout of new parachains and auctions, and hopefully like the new governance, and quite a bit of new staking work. Actually, I know there's been a lot of friction on staking. It sounds kind of boring, but it's kind of cool because like we've had all this stuff that had issues from the very beginning, like how many people can stake on Polkadot and stuff like this, and we've built out like all these like kind of like V0, V1 primitives in like staking, governance, cross-chain messaging, all of this stuff. And we're actually like ironing out a lot of these like issues and getting more, say, like production grade stuff that's like really been like polished, is scalable, is a lot more usable, has tutorials and stuff. And so I think we're kind of at like a cusp of where a lot of application and parachain development can really take off. Like all of these, we have all these like kind of like isolated components and building blocks that we've been refining over the last couple of years, and now they're finally coming together and are going to be usable in a lot more advanced ways. So I'm just really excited about like the next year and to see where this stuff is going to go, how people are going to use it. And as far as like where to check out, like definitely the Polkadot wiki, we try to keep a pretty extensive like resource there. And then I guess like all the normal stuff like Polkadot and Kusama Twitter, and I should have been prepared for the social media manager is going to kill me for this, but yeah, I'm sure we can get links for the show notes. But like Polkadot Twitter and some other channels where we post a lot of updates.
Definitely. And if I'm not mistaken, you have your own podcast, I believe, as well, if you wanted to promote that.
Yeah, I haven't done an episode in a while, but hopefully I'll get some more this year. It's called Relay Chain.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joe Petrowski, for joining us. Look forward to all your work in the future. All this stuff couldn't have been done without people like you, and I know our listeners greatly appreciate it. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Huge thank you to Joe Petrowski and our listeners. Make sure to like, subscribe, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Brian Hoffman, and this has been the Parachain Auctions Podcast. This content is not financial or investment advice. All interviews and discussions are opinions only. Kraken does not endorse the accuracy of this content. None of the following information should be construed as a recommendation to support any specific Parachain project or to participate in Parachain auctions in general. See our terms of service for more information.